Demos. This event is the launch event for the Demos Public Services 2030 network. So what we're trying to do here is create a network of people from national government to local government to civil society to corporate kind of spaces to come together and think about how we could reimagine public services for the next 10 years. And actually when we started developing this idea, and the challenges that we face now, I think this event is why I joined Demos. When I looked at the people who had signed up to this event, we had people from every domestic government department. We had people from Labour, from Conservatives, from national government, from local government, some brilliant people from across civil society, charities, and corporates. And I think that is really what Demos is about, how we convene and bring together people from different parts of society, government, politics, to imagine change together. So this event, we're going to kick off the conversation about public services by asking, why is now the time to reform public services? How can we balance it with everything that's going on, the need for investment and the backlogs? But also the question of what is the goal of public services? What's the purpose of public services? So to help us, we've got some absolutely fantastic speakers here today. So I'm going to introduce each one. We've got Chris Naylor, is Director of Inner Circle Consulting and former Chief Executive of Barking and Dagenham Council. On the screen, we have Josh McAllister, who led the independent review into children's social care, and as of this week has been announced the chair of the new combined What Works Well for Social Care and Early Intervention Foundation. It's a mouthful. Those two organisations are coming together, and Josh is bringing them together, and I think that whole early intervention prevention angle is something that I'd love to draw out in this conversation today. George Gould is leader of Camden Council and chair of London Councils, and then my colleague Ben Glover is acting head of research at Demos and is going to introduce some of the Demos ideas around this as well. So the format is straightforward. Our speakers are going to speak for roughly 5 minutes each, setting out their thoughts on these questions. But as soon as possible, I want to open it out to the room and bring in some of the brilliant voices we've got in the room as well, and make this much more conversational. We're trying to steer off politics, but there is more wine afterwards, and we can talk about that straight afterwards. So I'm going to start with Chris.
Oh, wonderful, thank you. Hello everyone. So I'm going to primarily address question 1 and 3, and then maybe in the Q&A we can get into 2. So I was involved a little bit in the development of the Demos publication, the relational state. I think it was a relational public services. And there was a phrase in the opening paragraphs of that report that said this, I'll read it to you. Some problems are so big that you can't see them, right? And, or rather you don't see them, I think, until they kind of punch you in the nose, and then you're kind of reeling to respond to them. And that report referred to climate change and to kind of post-truth politics and to global pandemics and all these like big hairy things we're dealing with. And I do genuinely think that public services and public service reform is one of those big things that's so big that you can't always see the nature of the challenge and therefore are unable to respond to it. But I do think we must. And it's almost as if maybe today's the right day to talk about this, that some of these problems now are kind of so big that they're good. Right? If you're in the business of change anyway, because it's starting to become increasingly implausible and untenable, I think, for people not to at least have a glimpse of them and have a sense of the importance of responding to them. So I do think public services are one of those, and I love public services. I've devoted my entire career to working in them and helping and supporting them. But my simple view, I think, is they're not working. Or rather, they're not working in the way in which their founders thought they would work. And why would they? Because essentially they were designed by our great-grandparents' generation to deal with the context of the first quarters of the 20th century, and not to deal with the context of the 21st century. If you just think of some of the kind of underpinning assumptions of the Beveridge welfare state, full employment, a growing economy, the fact that he rather assumed virtually by not saying anything about it at all, that he assumed that women would stay at home and do all the caring, kind of massive free gift of infrastructure, social infrastructure to the economy. This view that kind of people were generally fine and something might happen to them and the state would be there to pick them up in a kind of episodic moment where there'd be a kind of a treatment. Well, none of those assumptions hold today. And maybe they didn't hold then, but they definitely don't now, and that's a problem. But it's a problem that's so big we can't see it, and we need to reveal it and tell stories about it. A little under a decade ago, the King's Fund published a report that said just over 60% of all spending on the NHS was paying for the treatments for people who were living with long-term comorbidities, for which there was effectively no cure, but almost all of which could have been prevented. A problem that's so big you can't see it. This is the same NHS that every single year that I've been alive has seen a real terms increase in its spending. At some point, that's not going to be sustainable. And at the same time, it feels we've had like sort of 4 decades of not really getting to grips with that. We had kind of a marketisation, efficiency drive through 1 decade. We had sort of Francis Fukuyama walked in and sort of declared the end of history for public services with a kind of new Labour, new public management. I used to work for the Audit Commission, I could get over this kind of stuff. And then for the last 10 years, the sort of fantasists have been telling us, the fantasists on the left and the right, have been telling us there's a thing, and if we do this thing, everything will be okay. And it's revealed kind of like in the last week that that's not a great strategy. That's not a great strategy. So why now? I think to some extent this is the decade where some of these big things are going to keep coming along and punching us on the nose. We've had the pandemic. We've got what's happening now to our economy. It's quite possible, I know there's been some storm surge on the eastern seaboard of the United States that kind of wipes billions off the real estate values in Manhattan and Boston. There's real things that might happen that enable us to get a glimpse of the big problem and tell a story about it and do something about it. But I also think it's now because we just need to name it. We need to call it out and tell it, because I think the more realistic and perhaps depressing version of this is a kind of a slow decline, a sort of a kind of constant, not quite working, failing, A&E not quite right, almost like a sort of loveless marriage that's kind of bumped along for a while, but sort of is under pressure, and it's getting, and the joy that was once there and the moments of sort of companionship and trust have gone, and it's just getting bitter and angry, and I'm very happy by the way, just she's amazing. But of course in those situations the fantasies will come along, won't they, and say buy an Alpha Romeo or something. So, but here's the point, and I'm sort of rambling towards a conclusion here. I think we all think the reason why we're here tonight, why you're here, why are you here, is because enough of us think things can be different. It's so bad, it's so good that we have to. Now's the moment, right? And I think we need to kind of share our stories about why we personally think things could be better and different, and then see if everyone else shares those stories, and let's then start to knit together the universal truths that come from. And let me just very briefly, I know we're up against it on time, tell you my version of that story, why I think things can and need to be better. So I joined, I sort of graduated from university in 1994, weaponised New Labour. My professor at university was Anthony Giddens. I went to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers. I went to work for the Audit Commission. I was like literally stripes on my arms in public management, right? I thought we'd cracked it, thought we'd sussed it, and then in 2014, I became the Chief Executive of Barking and Dagenham Council in East London. So half an hour over there. And when I got there, this is what I found out. In a place that is 25 minutes away from the most successful city economy on earth, at a time when we had never spent more on health and social care in the history of mankind. And after, the council was bloody 4-star rated, right? The average healthy life expectancy of women in that borough was 53 years old. That's the age at which you're so ill you can't work. And that was the average. 100,000 women living diminished lives. Now the public sector could, and indeed what was happening, unless we intervened otherwise, was doing the Beveridge thing. A needs assessment, putting the money in based on some kind of formula to try and fix the consequence of 100,000 women either unable to work or on a journey to being in that condition. For me, that was not sustainable. We couldn't afford to do that. It wasn't the good life. So the question for me was like, what on earth is going on in their lives and has done for decades that's meant that that's the case? And how do we then reimagine and redesign our institutions in the image of that experience that understands the structural reasons why those things have happened, the deficits of power, and then design from first principles public services that respond to that challenge and not the presenting need of the consequence of our society and economy that's led that to be the case. So this is all very complicated. It's slightly more by the show. It's complicated and complex, and there isn't a fantasy easy answer. But I think we're starting to get a sense of what these things are. There isn't one idea. There is something about our political economy. There is something, I think, about our institutions and their design. There's something about professions and how they're protected to change and the emergence of new professions. It's about digital, about relationships, about care and love and participation and subsidiarity. It's all of those things at once, together, knitted, I think, in a new way of thinking about the future. But I think finally, and I'm so pleased that George is here, because I think it's ultimately about politics as well. I think it's very interesting. There are actors both on the left and the right who will tell versions of this story, not all of it, bits of it. And what's very interesting, I think Georgia is a shining example of this, but neither of the political parties yet have claimed this and made it their own. But one of them could. And my contention is that whichever does and finds the way of describing these new forms of public services will be in power for a generation, and they will define the future of public services in this country for the next 2 or 3 generations. And I think that is something to be optimistic and hopeful about. Thank you.
The optimism and hope.
Yeah, come on. Things literally can only get better.
Just sum that.
And then let's not turn this into a rally. Josh.
Thanks, Polly. Chris, great to follow what you said there and the optimism at the end. I think why now? Well, why now is in many ways because of what Chris said, which is that we're out of conventional answers to these problems, and what we've seen is a growing sense that the public spending pressures on public services are becoming so extreme that you've got both the overall pressure on whether we've got enough money going into those services, but people really knowing that even if we put more money into some of these services, actually what might happen is more of the same, which is a growing sense that spending gets skewed towards late crisis intervention. And there are a couple of examples where we've seen that in recent years. As Polly said in the introduction, I've recently completed the independent review of children's social care, where we've seen a big increase over decades in the number of children in care, and that's come at the same time in the last 12 years as we've been spending significantly less on supporting families, with the honourable exception of Camden and Georgia's leadership and a couple of other places. I should say as well, I've got a dog barking in the background because they want to go to the toilet, so pardon the interruption there. So we've got extreme public spending pressures, and we've got, I think up until now, attempts at reforms. So attempts even at the sorts of things that Chris was talking about end up being captured by the legacy system. So because they're on the fringe, because they're small efforts usually, they're adopted by the legacy system to prolong the life of services that have got a mindset and a way of operating that's out of date, to prolong their own lives, rather than being given the space and the opportunity to grow into the new institutions that we need. And one of the, I think the analogies for that is it's like trying to kind of launch a rocket for this new way of doing things without enough fuel to get the velocity needed to break orbit. And so what happens is it comes crashing back down to earth, and everybody looks and points and says, well, we tried that and it didn't work. And that's, I think, the cycle we're kind of stuck in at the moment, which is we're doing bits of some good stuff, but none of it's quite enough to demonstrate what could be possible, how different things could be. And the final reason for why now is that we've tried the recipe of market-led reforms, which don't give us the answer. Statism isn't the answer either. There are problems with that. Chris is quite right that the byproduct of new public management is all around us. We can see the problems that brings. And so something new is needed. So I think there's a couple of ideas that I think give us a sense of what a reform programme should look at. I think it should be shifting us from having a prescriptive set of public services to intuitive public services, built from the bottom up. So intuitive means responding live to what you're seeing families and individuals needing to live the good life, to have the capabilities to flourish. And that probably means services having fewer people interact with a family. It certainly means deeper relationships. It means more action and less assessment. It's more like building a system as a roundabout, where services are driving into that roundabout, thinking harder about what they're doing and how they relate with other drivers than it is about what we've currently got, which is a lot of traffic light systems with warning signs and lots of furniture on the crossroads. Traffic lights are famously more expensive. They cause more accidents, they're slower. Intuitive roundabouts are faster, cheaper, and that's because it heightens professionals' need for awareness of one another. So we need much more intuitive services. The second is that we need more locally responsive rather than nationally set services, and that means creating a space for community-led responses that are adaptable and accountable. This is the one benefit you get from devolution that we don't talk about as much, which is the accountability loop between who's providing the service and the public gets tighter, and I think that's one of the real benefits. So creating that space, and then finally skewing services to be earlier rather than later in their intervention. Now that's about what services are doing within their own boundaries. So the NHS trying to bring its spending and activity earlier on, social care doing the same, the justice system doing the same. But it also extends to some of the big social drivers for needs of public services. You know, the costs of poverty that rack up on other services that we're perfectly prepared to spend hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds picking up, don't really get factored into debates about the benefit system. So having a stronger economic case for reducing poverty rates and the benefits that brings from a more dignified, happier life to live, but also services that aren't needed as often would be crucial. And then just really briefly, some enablers that I think give us some ideas about how to make some of that happen. And it's a weird one to start with, but His Majesty's Treasury, I think HMT are a really unhelpful influence on this sort of activity that we're describing here, because they essentially shadow box with every single domestic department in Whitehall. Anything that is considered novel and contentious, they crawl all over. And what they need to do is model the behaviours at the very top of the financial tree in public spending that we want to see emulated and cascaded throughout the public realm. And that means Treasury setting a budget for a department for 3 to 5 years, and then giving freedom and responsibility to those closest to the action to make decisions. And that is so far from how HMT operates at the moment. So a new remit and role for Treasury. I think it means doing some difficult work and painful, boring work in getting co-terminosity right and sorting out local government so that the infrastructure is there to be devolved to. It's a patchwork at the moment, and it evolves, and there's some good reason for why that's happened. but we're now at a point where if we're serious about subsidiarity and devolution, somebody needs to make some decisions that we're probably going to have lots fewer local councillors, and we're going to have to make some decisions about what places look like. Thirdly, we need to target public borrowing on investments that flip systems. So the review that I've led is called for £2.6 billion over 5 years of spending, which as a result of that investment would leave the spending profile of children's services permanently altered, with less being spent on care and much more being spent on supporting families. And there are a couple of public services where future governments, I think, should be making the case that to bend the trajectory curve away from even higher costs on the NHS and even bigger liabilities and costs for local government, smart and thoughtful targeted investments to flip where spending is being directed would be key. Fourth, we need to change the rules of the game. Mariana Mazzucato's missions, I think, are a great way of thinking about this. So what are the top objectives we're trying to achieve, make them long-term, make them aspirational, and then inspectors, regulators, government oversight needs to be aligned behind those missions. And then the final thing is creating some space within all of that, which I think should happen across the entire public sector, margins, bureaucracy reform, but giving some space for genuine and probably quite risky experimentation of trying to start again. So taking areas where the state is comprehensively failing and asking the community in that area, who gave you all the money that we're spending on public services, and we started again, what would it look like? And in the wheelhouse I know more about social care. If we were to give, I'm not suggesting we do this, but it's a good thought experiment. If we were to just give families the money that we spend on the £10 billion a year children's social care system, we gave the families the money that we spend on service, we'd be giving each parent, we'd be giving each family of each child £14,000 a year. And I think we need to ask ourselves the question of whether or not that, for some families, would actually produce better outcomes.
Josh, thank you so much. Georgia.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the kind words. I did say I would only come on this panel if everyone said nice things about me. But it's really hopeful actually to be here and part of this discussion. It feels very appropriate today to be talking about the future of public services. I hope all the Conservative candidates are watching this discussion. But I think for the first thing I wanted to say is I don't think that reform can be an alternative to investment. Anyone who's working in public services knows that the system is straining and in many places a breaking point. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, many services are being held together by the kind of care, dedication, and love of public service workers. And any further cuts, they don't create creativity. It's more burnout, more exhaustion, and so we have to find a way to drive investment as well as reform, and also to acknowledge the impact of poverty on mental health, on physical health, on outcomes in the criminal justice system. And unless we invest earlier, then we won't, and really deal with some of the distributional challenges we have and the lack of income so many in our community have, then we won't solve these big challenges we're talking about. But I absolutely agree with what's been said previously, that funding alone isn't going to solve these issues, and we do need to see reform. And that the question that I think one of the questions you posed at the beginning is, what should be the purpose of public services? Should they just be responding to need? And for me, I don't think that's what they should be doing, or indeed just looking at prevention. I think public service should be investing in the capacity and strengths of people and communities, and unlocking the resources that people and communities already have. And I I really agreed with Josh's point about the critical nature of relationships and moving to more intuitive public services. And just to give one example that I think really brings it alive is when I talk to my community, their experience of interacting with the job centre is one where their dreams and ambitions are not cherished. They feel that they're pulled into a kind of system and a pathway that doesn't necessarily work for them. They feel very powerless, despite the best intentions, I think, of the system. And where we've been working in Camden to create a completely alternative employment support service, which is community-based and investing in universal basic services around that. And just as when you go to the NHS, you get a different intervention if you've got a broken leg or your liver damage, you have different support depending on what your need is. So for some people that's childcare, for some people that's access to a digital device, for some people it's training. But you have staff who are empowered and have the resource to be able to provide somebody with what they need based on a relationship and based on a real care that they're taking of that person's journey and that person's dreams. And I think those are the two systems, and that's the shift we want to make. I think critical to all of this is sharing power and relationships. I think if you don't do that, public services fail. And that can be really hard work. And we talked about, Josh talked about the social care system, and there's no greater power that the state has than the power to remove somebody's children from them. And that's the responsibility, the safeguarding responsibilities that councils have. But even in that place, that really difficult place, I think it is possible to change that power dynamic and to work alongside people, and that's the journey we've been on in my authority. And we worked with parents who themselves had had children taken away by the council to look at what happened, what had led up to that, and could we have done something differently to prevent it. And those are hard conversations to have for those parents who came back to somewhere which had caused huge trauma for them, but also for our staff who doing the best they can to protect and keep children safe. And so they had really raw and honest conversations, I think brave conversations, apologies were made, and real change came out of that. Parent advocates who've been through the system are now involved in all child protection cases, and we've invested heavily in family group conferences. I know something you also did in Barking and Dagenham, where we work with the community around and the family around a child or a vulnerable adult, and professionals get out of the way and they allow that community to find solutions. And I think what's really powerful about that work is that ideas emerge that are beyond the imagination of any individual, of families or professionals, and children are supported or adults to thrive. And in order to work in that way, our staff in Camden talk about love and relationships all the time. They have a mantra, "To love is to act," a banner that they hold up. And I think it requires a different relationship with risk for them to hold relationships, to bring their whole selves to work, and to constantly be having a dialogue about that risk. But the outcomes are transformative. And just to give one story, which for me is really powerful, of one of our conveners who was working with a former looked after child who wanted to reconnect with their family, and they couldn't remember exactly where they lived, but they just knew it was kind of by a station and by a river. And this worker got out Google Maps, found the map, drove out there and knocked on every single door in the area until they found this young person's grandparents, and he's now connected with his family. And for me, I think that's love in practice, and we talk very openly about that. And that can all sound very woolly, but I know as Josh came to see our services, the outcomes are really powerful. We just had Ofsted in, and they gave us outstanding, and we've seen a 30% reduction in children coming into care without changing those thresholds. And so we're saving money, but most importantly, I think we're investing in children and families to thrive. So I think that, and you can apply those principles of working alongside people to any public service. I think the second core kind of principle that I think is deeply important is working in collaboration. We talk about integration a lot now, and where we see public services coming together around people. And I think there's some really good examples around the country. I was in Manchester recently where they've really driven through health and care integration, and they had social workers and district nurses visiting people together, building real relationships in communities and creating an infrastructure with public sector workers empowered to make decisions for their community. And I think that only works if it is a true dialogue. And then I think that the third principle that I think is really important is having public services that are purpose driven, and we in Camden have worked with Marion and Mezzoclato on a missions-based approach, and missions are taking a long-term inspirational goal, which is something that belongs to the whole community, and using that to bring together the private sector, the public sector, communities, voluntary sector, again, to unlock solutions that nobody would have been able to come up with alone. And that approach, I think, is really powerful because it creates an energy and a momentum. But I think it works most powerfully in place, and I think that's the final thing I'd say, that place can be such an important organising principle. It brings people together. Businesses are located in a place, people are located in a place. It's a common language that connects. And so I think if we're serious about all of this work, we do really need to have a completely different relationship with local government and devolve power in a new way. But then when that power comes to local government, it has to go out to communities, and those two things have to happen together. So I think that the thing that gives me hope is this isn't something that we're just theoretically kind of talking about today. It's something that's happening. It's happening in communities around the UK, and there's a green shoot of change. And I think if we can bring together that practice, we can really transform things and change lives.
Thank you. So you've all touched on the theme of relational public services, and I just want to say how radical I think it is to hear the word love in public policy circles. It's almost uncomfortable, but it's vital.
Well, we had the Treasury down to look at all of our services and why we were saving money. I think, Josh, you were there, I think. And I think can you imagine when they turned up and it was like, we're going to see kind of, numbers, and actually you saw a bunch of people talking about love and relationships. So that's the shift we need.
How did it go down?
I think it went down well.
I'm going to come back to some of those questions of how you tell this story and how it meets kind of the reality and how you scale it, where so much of it is very kind of leadership based at the moment at a local level. But Ben, I'm going to bring you in to kind of talk about some of the work we've done around relational public services, just to put a lot of that in the context of our thinking on it.
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of hard act to follow. What a great panel. So thank you for coming, and thanks everyone for coming along this evening. Hope this can be the start of like a really good conversation. For us, relational public services is our sort of wonky, silly name for a new vision of public services, which recognises that people's social connections are often some of the most important things to their lives. So we know there's such good research on the importance of social connections for everything from your health to finding a job. So I'm looking at Andrew, who wrote a great report, which we can talk about afterwards, around how we can build better social capital to help people find work. And I'm sure you saw the great study in America recently. The Brookings Institute found between 70 and 80% of people find their jobs through their social connections. Yet our public services just too often engage with us on a one-to-one basis without considering the fact that we are individuals rooted in communities, rooted in families, and rooted in social networks. So relational public services are essentially public services that acknowledge that fact, acknowledge that essential social fact about us, and work with those relationships to help us instead of ignoring them. So the classic example I always like to use is the example of job clubs. So instead of having a kind of one-to-one relationship with your work coach in a job centre, which we have plenty of thoughts on, Georgia, and I thought that matches the people in your community, you're put in a group of people who are also seeking work, and you can leverage your friends, connections, and you can leverage other people who are in the group to help you find work. Kind of sounds a bit radical and crazy. It's been tried in quite a lot of places and it works quite well. So that's the idea. Social connections are really important. Public services too often don't acknowledge that, and we need to leverage social connections, people's relationships to help improve outcomes. The other thing about relational public services, which is probably more radical, is seeing public services, seeing a goal of public services is actually building relationships as well. So it's not about just taking people's relationships and using them in the formal delivery of services. It's actually seeing how can public services, especially universal public services, actually enable the building of relationships as well as using them in services. And that, I think, is how at Demos we think about the prevention question, which I think we can kind of frame the prevention question in different ways. Is it about preventing problems? Is it about building relationships? Sorry, about building resilience. But I think we see building resilience as really crucial to the prevention question, and that relationships are so important. And this is why I think we kind of early days in our thinking on this, but I think there's a real kind of synergy between relational public services and the universal basic services work, because services in which a larger group of people are participating are going to be stronger at building diverse social capital, essentially. So that's sort of like our thinking on relational public services. I want to kind of hear from everyone from the floor, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. And I'd like to bring in thoughts from the audience as soon as possible, but there are kind of two main areas I want to kind of put back to the panel, and they kind of come from conversations I've had with people this week. So one was with a senior Labour person who was talking about all of these things, and you heard a lot of these things in the Labour frontbench conference speeches, but they haven't got the story around it. And actually the Conservatives and some of their work around social covenant have kind of regressed some of that work a bit more, but the framing of it, the story, and the challenge I heard from the Labour person was, how do we make this contestable? Because no one's going to say, oh, I'm not against community and things like that. How do you make it as a kind of an overarching policy, something that will actually connect on a national level with voters? And sorry, just coming on, Josh, I'm going to come back to you as well, because when you said HMT had to think differently about these things, I spoke with a senior HMT person today who put back some of these ideas to me and said, we need politicians to tell us this is important in order to prioritise this. So that's why I think the kind of political messaging around it, the storytelling, is important. Maybe start with Georgia. In Camden, do people know the overarching story of what you're doing?
I don't. Yes, a Camden resident. Do you know? Do you? I think more and more so. I think there is a strong sense. So if one of our schools would say we are part of a Camden family of schools and we are working, we have explicitly chosen not to go down an academisation route, but to stay with the council and to be connected into our community and to try and drive some of this change. If you talk to one of our businesses, I think they'd say they know that we've come to them and said, you are a neighbour and you have something to contribute. And increasingly, I think our citizens are part of that. So I talked kind of in a very focused way about some of our services, and we have amazing advocates for those services, and parent champions and community researchers and citizen scientists. We hold a lot of citizens' assemblies, so more and more people who are kind of part of a conversation about the borough, and I think feel that they have a stake in its future. I think there is a real striving, a real desire for that greater sense of community, and we did a citizens' assembly on health, and we gave out people all the evidence, and I thought stupidly really that it's something the biggest issue would be a kind of tangible health issue, obesity or something, but actually the number one health issue that people identified was community connectedness, by far, and we wouldn't have got that if we hadn't have had a different kind of conversation. And I think when we saw in Camden, really sadly, a number of young people killed through knife violence. And when the community came together on the back of that, again, what came out of those conversations was anger about the cuts in services and income that we've seen nationally. But the strongest force was a real sense that we didn't have those strong bonds and communities that brought up children, and that sense of a kind of village supporting the child, and how did we bring those together. So I think that comes very strongly, that desire for community, but also for power, and I think that's why the Brexit take that power kind of narrative was so strong. So I think that the kind of Labour story has to be about how we hand over power and give people power over their lives and their communities, and it's an alternative to the essentially the Conservative one, which makes it about a kind of national immigration story. But I also think the thing that makes it Labour is that we understand that there are, I'm the politician on the thing you asked me of the Labour thing, is about is about you actually empowering people. A universal basic services is quite bold. People, they get free childcare, they get a digital device. In some instances, they get cash that they understand how to spend themselves. So it's the I think it's the community side and the investing in relational public services. But at the end, there's a distributional change, and we're empowering people not just in decision making, but also with resources.
And has this approach saved money?
100%. So I think if you look at our children's and adults, we're one of the only councils in the country that aren't overspending on our children's services, and the reduction of children coming into care is entirely because of that preventative and investment that we made. So we invested heavily at the start of austerity, and as a result of that, we have saved money, and we can evidence that.
Thank you. Chris, was there anything you wanted to add?
What I was thinking actually was that I think we talked about this previously. It is quite hard, I think, to have a cohesive sort of story of what could and should be. I'm increasingly of the view that we need to kind of get the narrative around the problem definition right. Because I think when you expose the problem and then people kind of think about it in their own lives, the story starts to tell itself. And to some extent, the story will be different for different people. If I just put a little bit of colour around that, we wouldn't have been able to do anything that we did in Barking and Dagenham without the political leadership. And their story of what needed to change in Barking was a combination of, it is literally, it is a post-Fordist place in the kind of institutional sense of the word, and it used to have a massive Ford factory, right? They employed loads of people, and it was, a place that got the life battered out of it in the kind of late 1990s. And then in 2006, at the height of the New Labour years, 6 years before the Olympic Games in East London, 12 members of the British National Party got elected to the council. They only stood 13 candidates, right? And those of you who are kind of in the political, you can work stuff out, right? And I think the general consensus view is, had they stood in all 51 seats, they'd have taken the council. In 2006, the National Political Party. For those on the outside, you probably looked at them sort of, slightly dismissed as sort of, nasty white working class racist, a bit thick, what on earth is that about? No, canary in the mine, right? What that was people saying, this is not okay. We are not living the good life. We can't see hope and future. And that was certainly the kind of the political imperative that came into a conversation about what needs to happen. Now, we didn't always knit all of that together, but it was we mobilised around a conversation about the problem that needs to be fixed, and that resonated with people. And I'm not making a political point now, but I'll just observe the fact.
You're an auntie now.
Yeah, almost. Like not on Twitter. Put the drink down, Chris, or the phone. Can't have both at the same time. But here's the thing, right? So that thing happened in 2006. Since 2010, every single seat in Barking and Dagenham has been Labour, right? Because I think they nailed the story. What was wrong? What could be better? And so I think the universal truth is probably around the problem definition, rather than necessarily how it will play out in different places in terms of the solution. The principles are right. Whether or not they kind of win votes on a doorstep, I don't know.
Josh, your review of children's social care, when it came out, I counted the number of times the word love was in it. I can't remember, but it was 50 something, or like, you know, and I thought that was brilliant. But I also thought the table that shows the 10-year savings from investing in preventative early help and stopping children going to care was one of the most kind of strongest cases I've seen kind of in cold hard numbers for preventative work. What I wanted to ask you, and I know you might be slightly constrained in what you can say about this, but how is that meeting the reality of making the case now for that early investment?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's stacked up against a long list of things the government are deciding what to spend money on, or indeed cut money from. The thing that is holding in all of those discussions is the fact that this will be costing us more money in 10 years. You know, in 10 years from now, if we don't do things differently, instead of having 80,000 children in care, we'll have 100,000 children in care. Instead of the system costing us £10 billion, it will cost us £15 billion. That's before inflation. And the system will be worse for it. So it's going to be more expensive and less effective and more miserable for thousands of people. And the same can be said for the NHS. The same can be said for adult social care. The same can be said for you know, bits of the transport system. There are bits of the public realm that are just becoming unsustainably expensive for what people are getting. And I think that this is where the argument needs to use some of the mechanics of new public management to take down new public management, because you know, you see people make the valiant, hopeful, futuristic case for things that can be different and be done differently. But you will have people saying, we've got to decide where to spend money. We've got to decide how to put money into something that seems to be failing. And people's confidence levels in doing that is very low. Frankly, the public's confidence levels in doing that sometimes is very low. So you've got to create the conditions of confidence for people to take some of these steps. And so there's a tricky balancing out there. And actually in the review, I spent a lot of time trying to think, how do we recommend things that don't use any of the orthodoxy of new public management? And the problem is, you can do that, but with the world we're in right now, you won't take anybody with you that you need to take with you to actually get something agreed. So I think that's it. You've kind of got to weaponize public management to take it down. And you've got to make the argument on cashable savings within service boundaries. You know, don't make the case that, well, if we do this here, it'll save money from criminal justice spending 10 years from now. No one buys that anymore, because that's not how, fortunately, that's not how public spending departments work. They tend not to give you a check back in 10 years after you've saved them money. So we've got to marry up all the things we're talking about here, which I completely believe in, and it's the only way forward. That's got to be married up with a really credible financial plan and delivery plan to make it happen.
I'll just say one thing, so I completely agree with all of that, and I think that's sort of the counterfactual is really important. There is definitely, I think Joshua was saying earlier, the point that I thought was really interesting. One of you was saying, the Treasury officials saying we need politics, because I think at the moment it feels like they've got a version of Word that every time they write the word investment, it autocorrects to spend. And it's like, no, try right now to spend. And so just that sort of meta kind of framing is the thing. But I also think we kind of need to break down the challenge, because some of this is definitely complex, long enough, and will require big spending decisions and will be tracked over 5 to 10 years. Some of it will require a bit of double running or triple running, which will require spending decisions. But some of it is just get on with it, right? And you know, one of the things, so we tried to build a roundabout in Barking, to use your metaphor earlier on, and we literally took, you know, the front door of adults, children, housing, homelessness, drug, alcohol, etc. Said, let's try and get to the root causes. Let's do it forming a new relationship with people. But essentially, and this is the new public management plan, we kind of redesigned it in a really kind of like pathways, You know, all of that had a business case, and the point I'm rambling towards is like 17 million quid's worth of service went in, and the service that came out the other end cost 13.5, and was better, right? That took us like a year and a half. So I suppose the point I'm making here is there's layers of narrative and argument we need to have, but also we can get caught up in, well, we need the investment, we need to make the case, or just get on with it. Like,
Yeah, you start by getting started.
Start by getting started. Give it a WhatsApp group for mums who are in debt. It's one of the most powerful things we did, and it cost literally nothing.
I'm going to overrun by 10 minutes because I was terrible and started 10 minutes late. If anyone needs to go, I totally understand. But I would love to bring in some members of the audience. Do you want to, I'm going to go lady at the front and then the gentleman there.
Thank you. That was a really, really insightful panel. I have a question. I recently read Hilary Cotton's book on reforming public services. I thought it was really good. And I feel that the conversation has been really helpful in terms of systems and structures and how you fundamentally reform systems. But my takeaway from Hilary Cotton's book, a lot of it was about the people. And I was really interested in how she got psychologists and ex-policemen and women and nurses and all sorts of different people with all sorts of different life experience that could come in and contribute to the conversation in a slightly different way. So my question to you is, how do you bring in those people? How do you incentivize the right people to come in to really inform public services in the actual delivery of it? Are you already doing this? And if you are, what's the best way of bringing in this like really multidisciplinary group of people that together can have like a really impressive power?
Thank you. And then I'll just take 2 questions and then.
This is not a question really, it's more of a join the dots. Is that all right?
Of course, yeah.
Brilliant. So, fantastic this whole panel. Absolutely brilliant. Networking's the best form of getting jobs anywhere. It's not rocket science, is it? But it takes a lot of good faith. So, Josh, we're clearly need to speak. So I was talking about the Early Intervention Foundation just now when I was stood here before we started, and I gave evidence to Graham Allen's review on that. If you want a narrative around this, because I think the Treasury, with respect to them, don't understand this stuff. But the narrative then was £1 spent before the age of 3 equates to 20 once they're an adult. And when you see the front page of that first early intervention report, you've got an MRI scan of a normally developed 3-year-old's brain and that of an underdeveloped one, right? You can't not get that once you've seen it. And I think the more people start to understand that, the better. I think what we've got to realise is, and we've talked about this before, because probably we did when we were talking recently, if you use a sport analogy, I think we've given, not necessarily the opposition, but we've given certain people too much respect which they don't deserve. They're not necessarily experts. And I was on something last week where, you know, the great and the good were waiting for great things from DWP and nothing came. And there's nothing there to call because they haven't got that background or the expertise. InLocal talked about the need to change the thinking and behaviour of the professionals before you can affect the service users, and I think that's one of the things that we need to concentrate on, is changing that behaviour, because currently, if you haven't seen it, it's the 5 dysfunctions of the team, which is the Patrick Lexioni model, which is very, very simple and very visual with it. And I think just finally, picking up on what Chris has talked about, one of the things that we do is you sit in the problem. See if you can make the problem worse, because if you can make the problem worse, what's the power implication? You can also make it better. And how do you do that? You deal in the business of reality and self-efficacy. So people are finally starting to wake up to self-efficacy. It's all psychology, sports psychologists, etc. But that boils down to personal accountability and responsibility, which the professionals need to do, which the residents of Barking, Dagenham or Camden or whatever need to do, because that's what's going to change everything for them.
Thank you. So that point around multidisciplinary working and Hilary Cotton's ideas, is that something that's influenced Camden?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's not always finding new people. The people you have the answers. And I remember talking to one of our longest serving housing officers, and we were doing some new neighbourhood reform, and she was like, "Yeah, George, we used to have that 15 years ago." Like you said, local government long enough, it all just comes around again. But you know, she had all the answers and experience. What can you create systems that stop people acting and create barriers and blocks? And I think it's about giving people permission to build those relationships and to act on them, to have the budgetary power to shape resources around those problems, and that you need to create kind of, I think, trust within your organisations to enable that to happen, and also for people to be themselves, because we used to have this thing called the Camden Way, and we thought that was, you know, our values. What people said to us is actually they felt like they had to kind of become the Camden Way rather than bring themselves and their authenticity and their diversity to their work. So it's also allowing people to be people, to hold those relationships, and to give a support structure around working differently and holding risk differently. But I also think that not losing that kind of the dialogue with those who are seeking to serve, because I remember we talked about that journey we went through with parents, and we used to have this multidisciplinary team meeting where we had all the professionals around the parent, and the parent would come in, and you'd have, you know, the GP and teachers and social workers, and we thought we were, you know, bringing everyone together and making things easier, but the parents' experience was, I'm being told I'm a crap parent by 10 people, and so I think it's how you actually it's not enough just to have a multidisciplinary team. It has to be you have to change the power balances and the relationship at the heart of it.
Any other stuff?
Yeah, I've got two questions. I was blown away by Josh's report. Thanks for spending all that time on it, Josh. I've been through the system myself, my children have. I've come against some quite interesting journeys along that system. And I think there's a certain amount of, since post-COVID as well, 75% of the people are living in a hyper-vigilance, trying kind of survival mode state. They won't make a decision. So we're not empowering these, and when they try and make a decision, make change. I was sat with an IRO from a local council last night, and he's leaving. He's on his third council, because every time he goes to try and change something, he's called it career suicide. Because you can't bring that up. It's against it's really refreshing to hear that. But the two questions that I've got is mainly towards, I really love the community thing, because I was just left a board that worked with indigenous tribes around the world, just to feed that in how they've asked for the Lake Queen. They went back to Lake Queen from Canada, the Dakota Nation tribes, and all they wanted back was their community spirit, because they had their spirit taken away from them. And they've got all the westernized problems now, alcohol, drugs, and all of those, depression and gambling in their reserves. But the head of the Robert Ficati, he had a really interesting conversation. He said, we went back to the Super Queen to ask them for our spirituality back, to connect back with nature, to connect back with love. Is what you're saying. We can learn a lot from these indigenous tribes. There's a great thing called the Children's Fire, where they always lead with the end in mind. How's it going to affect the children? But what we're seeing is these short terms of politics of 4 years. If, like, everyone talks about, will he get his votes? It shouldn't matter if he gets his votes or not. What's the right thing to do? And I think it's the entrance point. So in our research that we found, is the entrance point, Josh, and probably to you, 98% of care cases go through court in favour of the council. Without the right intervention, that's 98% of them. Each care case that goes through court is nearly £1 million. The entrance point to court is £2,055 to get the application fee through. And just alone in the last, 5-6 years, it's gone up 10,000 cases. So that's £20 million just an application fee, and what you were saying about the cost of that court case. And I've been stuck in one for over 18 months, and it's not gone anywhere. And it's based on false allegations. And you go, how do you get that early intervention? Because that's going to strip not a couple of million, like Dominic Resberg got, as we've got 238 million to spend on a tagging system that doesn't work. Boris gave children's mental health 74 million last year, which wouldn't touch the surface. So how would you get that balance where you go, what Josh is saying, work with the end in mind, these are the big numbers, but everyone's kind of walking around like with, I would say, blinkers on, going, that's not my role. And it's really refreshing to hear the council's actually doing something different, because I work with children in care in Birmingham just as a part of what we're doing, and just giving them a free meal got them to the college early and kept them there out of gangs. Just like you said, those simple acts of love. The last thing is, there is a way of funding this, but I think, like what Josh was saying, is you've got to make sure the funding's spent in the right place, because funding these people that fail in councils, then they go to another council, they take that and they can just go and get another job somewhere else. But there is a way. We're setting something up with Deutsche Bank called ESG projects, and looking at ESG funding and how that can impact. There's 42 trillion held in ESG funds not being spent. So it's that kind of collaboration of community, corporates, local governments, removing the barrier. And it needs those wider things to say, look, there's a trust failing. Most trusts, a lot of the trusts are failing. You could just take a trust that's in special measures and apply it quite quickly, because it's the lack of intervention right at the start that causes, like, well, the massive knock-on effect, and marrying that out, you're saving not just billions. The impact that has with the National Audit Office last week, worked it out, it will reduce the strain on camps and the NHS by 80% of the children's services required. So the wider is there as well. So how do you get it collectively? Not just saying what Josh is saying with regards to the care review, the knock-on effect of families not being able to get jobs, the trauma that then causes, I should say, is very traumatic. So I know I've covered probably about 8 things there, but 2 points. I'll rewind it. It's the entrance point. We're not looking at the entrance point into care, and the issue is CAFCAS. They were meant to give guidance in 25 years. They don't give guidance. So the courts expect them to give guidance. There's no guidance, so they just go through the court system until it's too late. And then the second point is the trauma it causes and the knock-on effect, I suppose, to sum it up.
So one of the things we want to do with this network around public service reform is to look at the individual areas and how a relational way of working would work in each of the kind of siloed areas of the state, but also critically, how do we blend those silos and make them work together better? Partly because I think we're seeing at the moment those silos breaking down kind of organically because of the strains in the system, but how could you make a benefit of that? But I just wondered, Josh, did you catch all of that? Was there just a quick response you wanted to give on those specifics?
Yeah, I did, more or less. Sorry, it was a little bit tricky with the microphone. I think when I was talking earlier about the velocity, having enough to get the rocket into orbit, and if we do a little bit of some of this good stuff, actually sometimes it gets used to continue justifying the legacy system. So in the review, one of the things that we saw, as well as local authorities like Camden that are outliers, they have done a sustained piece of work to shift the focus of their system. The leadership really get it. They're investing really smartly in supporting family-led solutions where that's safe and where that's right. But there are some other local authorities where leadership team comes in or an idea comes in and it doesn't get sustained. When that team leave, things revert back to type. And so I think when we were thinking about this with the review, you need to kind of set out a series of things that need to change simultaneously in a system that's already overstretched, at a time when budgets are constrained, and they're going to have to do both things at the same time. So you essentially need to show how do we make sure that a child who might end up in a residential children's home, because we don't have enough foster carers, has got the option of a foster family home to be in. And for those children who are in care in a foster home, have we really asked ourselves, if we used a fraction of the £70,000 that we spend on fostering to actually help a family figure out whether they could use a fraction of that money to come up with an alternative, could that work? So could kinship care be an alternative to care? And then if we asked ourselves, going back to that multidisciplinary team question, actually if we brought together the professionals who have got the skill and knowledge to make the difference, to help the family create the change that's needed, do they need to be anywhere near the child protection system in the first place? And you can't afford to only ask one of those questions. You have to ask all of those questions at the same time and do all of that work together in the current system. And I think that's why, thinking about this as missions, thinking about these as grand public service reform endeavours, and to Chris and George's previous point about getting the politics and the story of this right is so crucial, because delivering this stuff through government will be extremely difficult, and it will require, you know, people right at the heart of government, right in the Treasury, politicians across different government departments, special advisors, permanent secretaries, director generals, aligned think tanks. You know, the whole lot will need a shared theory, common theory and language to talk about what we're trying to do here. And you know, this is a great session, and I'm really pleased Demos is doing this, because it's starting to create a space where we might come up with that, but it's desperately needed. And in the absence of that, we're all trying to kind of figure our way through it, and we need to go further.
Josh, thank you so much. And just to that point, what we're going to do with this network is take this conversation forward. So in everything we've talked about, I've heard the case for relationship-based working, for preventative models, for strengthening communities as a solution, to redistributing power locally, but also how do we make the case for it? How do we tell the story around it? And how do we find different sources of funding, different ways of funding, kind of parallel experiments to get some of these things going? So each one of those is another session like this, where we can unpack and understand and really plot a path through what this can look like. So I would invite you all to kind of sign up to the network emails. We'll email out a capture of this conversation, so for your records, so you can think about it more, and make suggestions about how you want to take this conversation forward. It's your network to kind of help shape and evolve, and tell other people who you think might be interested in being part of this influential conversation about what we're doing here. Because often a panel event feels like the start of something, and then you go away and it feels a bit disappointing. This is the start of something. So I want to say thank you for being such a lovely audience and members of the network, and thank you very much to everyone on our panel for such brilliant and hopeful comments.
And you can hang on.